the end for me. How did I get here? Rufus. My name is Aristia Lamonique. I was raised to be the Empress, until some otherworldly girl appeared. The temples declared her to be the prophesized Empress, and I was relegated to a mere queen. Unfortunately, my husband did not care much for me. I thought a child would bridge the gap between us, but he disowned our unborn child, and even abandoned me after I miscarried. I begged for my father's life, but my pleas fell on deaf ears. What have I done? If I could begin my life again, I won't love you again.
Here's an important notice. This video contains spoilers, like a lot of them. So if you haven't read this and don't want spoilers, you should probably click off right now. Borimbattan Hwangbi, translated to The Abandoned Empress, is a web novel authored by Yuna and adapted into a webtoon manhwa by Ina. After observing the opinions on Reddit, my own comments, and general reviews online, I think it's fair to say that this is a rather contentious title. One of the biggest complaints I've seen so far really has to do with the ending, and while I'm of the opinion that's somewhat reductive, I can understand the sentiment, but not for the reasons you might think. This is something I'll go over later, but for now, the story of the Abandoned Empress takes place over 3 full seasons, with each season containing an average of approximately 50 chapters, give or take a few. As such, there is a lot of content to cover, but I'm going to try to distill it all in this video to key plot points and important events. Now, I should probably preface my review by stating that I will be basing this entire review on the webtoon manhwa only. I have not read the web novel, nor do I want to spend any more time on this title than I have to.
The best gift is the gift of never seeing you again.
I've already spent an entire month pondering over what I would even say in this review, and I do not want to see or hear from Aristia any more than I have to. By the way, I'm the Weebtooner, a hapless fool who has now accepted that he's inadvertently locked himself to reviewing shoujo josei content.
Only now, at the end, do you understand?
Our story is set in an overly romanticized vision of fantasy Europe sometime between the 1500s to the 1800s. It's kinda hard to tell, and quite frankly, no one really cares. The only reason this type of setting exists is to put men in fancy military dress uniforms and give the women overly decadent and fashionable dresses. This is a setting almost exclusive to the fantasy shoujo josei genre. If you stop and think a little bit about it, then you'll realize it's really all about the fashion and glamour of royalty nobility life. In other words, you're really just reading a scripted story of fictional celebrities. Anyway, our story takes place in the Castina Empire, which we will assume to be the global superpower of this world, as it seems to have no real enemies and every other named nation seems to either be a client or vassal state. The main religion seems to revolve around the deity known as Vita, who operates through bestowing divine power onto chosen priests and throws out some prophecy or oracle every now and again. There might be other gods in the world's pantheon, but the story never mentions them, or I just missed them. Altogether, Vita seems to be quite involved in the world of man, thus religion seems to play a role in the Empire's governance and the imperial family's right to rule. The Empire has gone through a relatively impressive 33 generations of rulers, but it just so happens that the 33rd Emperor, Mirkan Luciana Castina, despite being a good ruler, has but a single son to succeed him. The imperial family chooses its next emperor paternally, thus every emperor has an empress and a queen. The empress is the primary source for an heir, while the queen serves as a backup just in case anything goes wrong. There are 3 major families that support the management of the empire. First is House Rast, led by Duke Arkintaras, who commands the first militant arm of the empire. Second is House Verita, led by Duke Ruta Verita, who acts as the administrative arm of the emperor. And finally, House Monique, led by the lower rank Marcus Carrion La Monique, who commands the second militant knight order. All 3 houses lead the pro-imperial faction that advocate greater power for the imperial family. Conversely, there is an opposing pro-nobility faction that advocate greater power for each noble's individual interests. The Empire plays a balancing act between these 2 factions and has just recently recovered from an internal political uprising in Emperor Mirkan's time. In order to stabilize the Empire's current precarious situation and balance out power within the imperial faction itself, House Monique has trained its only potential heir to serve as the Crown Prince's future empress. Right away, we have a serviceable recipe for a story rife with political machinations, which is good and quite ambitious for a romance-centric story. We're given context and a little bit of wiggle room to play with politics using plot-contrived acts of divine intervention to create drama as needed. Therefore, it only makes sense for Vita, the god of fate, to prove itself as a malicious deity by ripping a naive modern-day high school girl from her own world and throwing her into the middle of a delicate political scenario. The temples interpret Ji-yoon's arrival as a divine message to hail this random otherworldly stranger as the new empress and relegate House Monique's daughter to the position of queen. Apparently, the world of man doing sensible things is not exciting enough, so it's up to the gods to put things right and introduce a healthy amount of chaos to disturb this fragile state of equilibrium. And so, our story begins as we follow Aristia La Monique, the queen, playing second fiddle to an alien. Despite being just a queen, she still manages the imperial administrative duties that the Empress, Ji-yoon, is incapable of performing. Now, what makes this dynamic rather interesting is that the audience can sympathize with both Aristia and Ji-yoon's plights. Ji-yoon is a teenage high schooler thrown into a completely different world against her will. Being Empress is her only option. It's not like anyone's giving her a choice here. Conversely, Aristia's life purpose was to serve as Empress. She's doing the dirty work but reaping none of its benefits. These two will not see eye to eye, and Ji-yoon's attempts to diffuse tensions between them are obviously fruitless. This problem is exacerbated by the current emperor, Ruthless Kamaluddin Shah Kastina, son of the late Emperor Mirkan. It's established that he passionately hates Aristia and uses every opportunity to belittle and antagonize her. He neglects her, punishes her for any perceived slight, impregnates her, disowns her unborn child, abandons her after she miscarries, executes her father, destroys her family house under uncertain pretenses, and then proceeds to taunt her with false hopes of absolution. Unsurprisingly, Aristia snaps, loses her proverbial head, takes a stab at Ruthless, gets charged with high treason, and is consequently put on the guillotine where she literally loses her head. Apart from Ruthless being a comically malicious and short-sighted lout, this is an extremely powerful opening. The first 6 chapters are used to painstakingly develop a protagonist the audience cares about and adds gravitas to the stakes in her next life. Vita decides that the story needs a sequel and rewinds the timeline so that Aristia wakes up in her 10-year-old body with all her past memories intact. We will then follow her next 6 years as she works to avoid her bad ending in this new timeline. But, because Vita is in dire need of amusement, it gifts Aristia with an oracle name, and now she goes by the title Aristia Pioneer La Monique. I hate it. With this new name, she's summoned before Emperor Mirkan, who's still alive in this new timeline, where she learns that receiving an oracle name gives her the right to inherit the imperial throne. Perhaps the only reason why she isn't immediately removed as a potential threat is because she's promised to Ruthless. She offers up knowledge of future events and proposes a solution to the pending drought. A solution that was originally drafted by Duke Ruth's genius second son in the previous timeline. This impresses Emperor Mirkan, Duke Ras, and Duke Ruth, and she inadvertently secures the imperialist faction support. She then wanders around the palace grounds and encounters the all-important plot tree before a young Ruthless shows up. He makes it clear he doesn't like her, Aristia's traumatized brain shuts down, and she then reaffirms her futile goal to avoid being tied down to the royal family. And it turns out that Alendis de Verita, Duke Ruth's second son who was supposed to draft the solution to the pending drought, is so impressed that a 10-year-old girl was responsible for this miracle proposal that he decides to go in person and see her for himself. He likes what he sees, and so begins his descent into madness as he becomes increasingly infatuated with Aristia over the course of 2.5 seasons. Aristia needs to find an alternative to joining the imperial family, therefore she begs permission from her father to wield a sword and begins training to become a knight so that she can one day take up her father's mantle and lead House Monique. Try as she might, Emperor Mirkan has no intention of letting Aristia break away so easily and ensures that she and Ruv attend all major empire events together and tentatively stay as his fiancée until she's allowed to decide for herself when she becomes of age. He's also aware that Alendis has his eye on Aristia, therefore he orders Duke Ruth to send his second son away to prevent any complications. Mirkan is perhaps the most crafty and politically savvy monarch I've seen in these sorts of narratives. There is an admirable level of sophistication in everything he does. Almost everything he does in this entire narrative makes sense, and he's characterized ridiculously well. But since you're not here to listen to me talk about this man, I'll be getting back on topic. Aristia passes her days peacefully without Alendis nearby until she meets Karsane de Ras, Duke Arkint's second son. Considering House Monique and House Ras have cordial relations, you'd think Karsane would be willing to extend this courtesy to its only daughter. Nope. Turns out that the moment he discovers Aristia to be a Monique and a woman, he becomes a complete jerk. He doesn't like the idea of some noble girl playing at being a knight and initially dismisses her resolve as a passing fancy to occupy her time until she marries. This incentivizes Aristia to redouble her training efforts, and Karsane, moved by her dedication, begins to come around and warm up to her. This is probably the first instance we see Aristia legitimately earn the abnormal adoration she's been receiving in her current timeline. Anyway, it appears that Aristia and Karsane become good friends and see each other often, which does not escape the notice of domestic and foreign nobles. Envoys from foreign and client states begin amassing in the imperial capital to see if they can put one of their princesses in the imperial line. Emperor American has probably already realized that sending away potential suitors isn't preventing others from showing up, so he apparently does nothing when Elendis returns from his tasks abroad. I mean, he's already slightly antagonized House Verita by informally exiling their second son, so I doubt he'd want to do the same to House Ras, who leads the Empire's prime militant order. So yeah, Elendis comes back much to Aristia's joy and immediately is at odds with her new friend Karsane. Meanwhile, Ruthless is dealing with international political pressure while Aristia plays with her Bulbasaur and Charmander. She's still plagued by her insecurities from the previous timeline and confides in Elendis at his insistence. He chooses not to believe her, and their relationship effectively ends here in Season 1. Aristia attends to Prince Ruthless at his coming-of-age ceremony where he proposes to make her the queen instead of empress. Although this is not said with any ill intent, she's horrified at the idea of following in her past self's footsteps, much to Ruthless's dismay. Season 1 ends with Aristia stealing her resolve to become heir to House Monique and follow through with her plan to sever ties to the Castina imperial line as she and her father flee the capital. Which brings me to Season 2. I'll start off by saying that Season 2 suffers from middle book syndrome because the story suddenly slows to a crawl as it attempts to introduce key plot points that yield mediocre or subpar returns in Season 3. You have no idea how disappointed I am to be saying that out loud. Duke Arkint and Duke Ruth are worried, and I kind of understand why. The Crown Prince's fiancé has fled to the countryside and seems to be doing everything she can to destabilize the Imperial faction's influence. If you stop and look at Aristia from the perspective of a pro-Imperial faction noble, then you can't help but feel that she might be clinically insane. Her actions serve to alienate her from the Crown Prince, which encourage foreign powers and the pro-noble faction to start exerting their own influence into the Castina Empire's political atmosphere. Not only that, but she's seemingly starting an affair with House Ras's and House Verita's second sons, which not only cause some friction between the militant and administrative arms of the Empire, but also puts both houses directly in contention with the next emperor. If her aim is to have the Castina dynasty rip itself from the inside out, then I must say she's doing a rather fantastic job of it all. Even if she no longer cares about being mother of the Empire, when you consider that House Monique's allegiance and prosperity is directly tied to the Castina imperial line via a blood vow, I cannot say that anything she's doing right now makes any semblance of sense. I was led to believe she was politically savvy in her former timeline, but what I see now completely contradicts that. The author has created a political setting for Aristia to navigate as she struggles to escape her bad ending, but apparently she can't be bothered to actually consider whether her current actions support any other type of ending. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you our protagonist who struggles not to trigger every death flag under the Imperial Sun and Stars.
Are you not entertained? Are you not entertained?
You know what? Let's just continue. Ruthless is spending his days tending to the Empire's administrative needs while wondering why his fiancée seems to be avoiding him. Elendis is spending all of his time moping in a dark room, throwing the occasional tantrum and pondering all the ways he can insert himself back into Aristia's life. Karsane spends his days training with Aristia and is now leading as the favored candidate. Now, Ruthless does make a house call to confront Aristia and attempt to settle their differences, but that goes horribly wrong and she undergoes the tropey blue screen of death. It's here where the author throws Ruthless a bone and allows him to discover a letter from Elendis which details the events from Aristia's past timeline. After finally coming to her senses by convincing herself the past and present timeline are different, she works up the courage to return to the capital and serve her days out as a squire in the 1st Imperial Knight Squadron under the Ras household. Now the next little bit focuses on Aristia's mother, Jeremiah La Monique, formerly Jeremiah La Sonia. Jeremiah died when Aristia was 6, and in order to cope with her passing, she cannot remember much of her mother. Coincidentally, Ruthless also has fond memories of Jeremiah and still mourns her to the present day. In order to have any meaningful development between Ruthless and Aristia, the author decided to use Jeremiah and the Garden Tree as plot devices to reinforce the fated ties that bind the two together. But like I said before, her indiscretions have not gone unnoticed, and Aristia finds herself in the middle of a politically motivated slander campaign. It is here where the inconsistency in Aristia's character become blatantly obvious. She has no idea that rumors of her indiscretions are being spread, and it makes her seem kind of dumb. Even Karsane knows better, and he's been with her the entire time. Since we now need a villain, Duke Xena is finally introduced and is leading the pro-nobles faction. He is obviously extremely antagonistic to Aristia specifically, and doesn't even pretend to observe the common courtesies despite owning a hollow title with no real power. For context, House Zena was once a militant arm of the imperial family, but was replaced by House Monique. After nurturing their growing resentment for a couple generations, they finally threw their lot in with the noble faction and were involved in the internal political uprising that ultimately failed. Although pardon, House Zena was disgraced and lost a great deal of power, but is still somehow leading the pro-noble faction. Whatever, now that Aristia has an enemy to fight, she decides to throw herself into imperial politics again. Up until now, we've not seen Aristia actually do anything politically savvy, nor have we seen her make any intelligent choices. So imagine, for a moment, my surprise when she transforms into another character and just effortlessly begins to solve all of her problems while wearing one of those conniving expressions on her face. You know, I would have appreciated a little more than an expositional flashback to explain this sudden competency after a string of idiotic maneuvers.
The unseen is the deadliest.
I don't know if she realizes just how much of a death flag she's putting on Karsane by allowing him to associate with her so frequently. It's rather fortunate that Ruthless is actually letting all of this slide and not actively punishing him, as their actions are technically spearing his name through the mud and causing him to lose face in front of the very nobles he's supposed to lead one day. I don't know if you know this, but a weak emperor does not stay emperor for very long. But no matter, because now we have princesses from other nations entering the capital to woo their way into the prince's good graces. Enter Princess Moira de Yit and Princia de Rua, two side characters who are largely inconsequential to the overall plot and exist only to give Aristia something to do as we prepare for the endgame. And so ends Season 2. Now Season 3 is interesting. It starts by developing the subplot of how Ruthless and Aristia become closer to each other by placing Aristia in the middle of a catfight with all of these princesses from foreign nations competing for a spot beside Ruthless. This would have been a lot more relevant if she was actually trying. Ruv is doing all the heavy lifting and does everything he can to sour relations with foreign powers, particularly with Princess Moira, to just get through to Aristia. She's still doing everything she can to cut ties with him, but that doesn't seem to discourage him much. The multiple princesses arc ends with Ruthless declaring that he won't pick any of the princesses to be queen and makes it very clear to Aristia that she's the one he wants. Despite realizing that the current Ruthless and past Ruthless are different people, she still can't shake her insecurity, so the entire arc can be summarized as a giant waste of time. It does not adequately progress the story, nor does it develop the intended pair enough to justify the amount of time it took. Furthermore, it also introduced a whole bunch of new side characters that the author now has to spend extra time to write out of the story. I think this may have been the time when the fanbase started to feel alienated, because the last half of Season 3 feels like what I can only assume to be as a mad dash to the end. Aristia rejects Elendis, who then joins the pro-noble faction for some reason, only to then fall into despair when he inadvertently aids in an assassination attempt on Aristia's life. Elendis requests an audience with the Emperor, further requests to be exiled, and is unceremoniously written out of the story to reduce any complications for our intended pairing. Karsane, on the other hand, defends Aristia from said assassination attempt and is blinded as a result. However, instead of keeping him blinded, we get plot-contrived magic to immediately heal said ailment. I don't like cheap shocks like this. Either keep him blind, or don't waste our time with these irrelevant developments. I don't need to know that it was Ruthless who arranged this miraculous healing event, because it doesn't make Aristia any less secure about their intended relationship. With the Emperor's health quickly failing, the pro-noble faction begins to become desperate as they are running out of time because Aristia is still set to marry Ruv. And speaking of time, the story suddenly remembers that June is a thing and she finally makes her appearance. Vita, the god of fate and quite possibly also the god of prolonged suffering, gifts June with a divine name and once again throws the political landscape into turmoil. What makes this whole thing truly baffling is that June is revealed to be the same past June who has traveled to the current timeline to... We'll get to that later, but trust me, it's mind-bogglingly stupid. Just know that June aligns herself with Duke Zena and the pro-noble faction and now acts as another antagonist to Aristia. So far, Season 3 has been a series of frustrating back and forths. Aristia constantly changes between acknowledging the current Ruthless and being insecure. The plot just moves to support this agonizing back and forth, which forces the reader into an unpleasant loop. The multiple princesses arc serves to confirm Ruthless's feelings for Aristia, while Aristia still wants to break free from him. Fine. We did not need a whole new cast of side characters nor that much time to get that message across, but fine. However, the moment she comes around to the idea of giving love with Ruve a second shot, Jiun arrives. That would have been fine if Jiun actually had a coherent reason for moving to the current timeline. Sadly, she does not, and in order to justify her inclusion into the story, we are introduced to even more side characters in order to create more stupid plot devices. Duke Zena reveal the origins of Aristia's mother, but apart from shocking her, the pro-noble factions don't really get anything out of it. Instead, it's used as an opportunity to have Ruthless and Aristia bond over shared memories of Jeremiah, and he once again affirms his affections for her. Then comes the most egregious plot device that truly gaslighted the entire fanbase. The poison. The poison. The poison. The poison. I truly cannot comprehend how the creators of this manhwa thought this was a good idea. I sincerely hope that this was an attempt to just quickly end the story because I believe that the poison is what outright kills this narrative. Everything that happens after Aristia discovers she's been poisoned can only be described as nonsensical. I truly believe that you need to read through the whole series and experience it for yourself in order for you to understand how outrageously stupid the next parts of my summary will be. Give me a moment. I need to prepare my anus for the sheer amount of gaslighting I'm about to go through. Okay, I'm good. After finding out that the poison's effects make her infertile, the Emperor succumbs to his illness and dies. Ruthless is then named as the 34th Emperor and falls into a depression until Aristia comforts him and shares a fairly well-executed heart-to-heart with him. This is good. It's progress. Then she wants to break off their engagement after the nobles suspect she's infertile. Imagine being Ruthless in this scenario. I do not understand why anyone in the fanbase feels more sorry for Aristia than for current timeline Ruthless. Cause you're hot, then you're cold, you're yes, then you're no, you're in, then you're out, you're up, then you're down. Ugh. To further reiterate my point, she then tries to cut ties with Karsane and the Imperialist faction, hoping to break away from politics and succeed her family in peace. I don't know if she's being naive or delusional because she still has a divine name and her family is still technically associated with the Imperialist faction. I can't imagine this would appease the pro-noble faction, and the pro-imperial faction would have no reason to look favorably upon House Monique after severely weakening their influence and running away to let them deal with the mess. Not to mention that House Monique commands the Second Imperial Night Order, so leaving them to their own devices would be insanely stupid for either faction. When this happened, I was praying she was planning a coup d'etat or something because Aristia no longer becomes a character any reasonable person can understand. And right after just thinking that, it was here that I remembered the existence of the blood vow. So it turns out that the blood vow can ensure House Monique's loyalty to the crown. Yes, I don't know if it was intentional or not, but the blood vow is a plot device that can be used to solve this rogue faction problem. Ladies and gentlemen, I do not know whether to be outraged or impressed. This is perhaps the most impressive use of a pre-planned plot device to justify an outrageously stupid scenario. Obviously, Ruthless can't just end our misery and accept Aristia's blood vow of loyalty, so we can continue this train wreck of a story. I'll give the blood vow the benefit of the doubt and overlook its obvious flaws because Ruthless then collapses only for us to discover he's been poisoned. Not just any poison either. It is the same stupid-ass poison that causes mood swings and infertility. This plot device is so terrible that it undermined the moving development from the earliest chapters. To add insult to injury, Aristia reflects on her reawakened love for Ruthless when he collapsed and they finally shared the fabled moonlight kiss. Sadly, this scene feels so hollow because later Aristia finds out that Ruthless still hasn't drafted the document to annul their engagement. She brings up the issue with Ruthless and states that her infertility makes her ineligible to be his empress. Okay, that's okay. I agree with Aristia, but we've already gone back and forth so many times that the one time I actually need to feel something, I just can't. Ruthless looks like he's finally given up, but then Priest Tertius shows up and tells Aristia she might be able to have children again. Are you serious? I can only assume that the fans must have had enough because they immediately close the whole poison conspiracy case and pull a last-minute red herring traitor act with a side character nobody cares about. This results in Aristia getting stabbed, but due to yet another plot-contrived magical ability, June is able to save her life using a one-time divine wish or something. Who even cares anymore? We are allowed to hear June's reason for being in this current timeline, and it is disgustingly stupid and does not make a lick of sense. I'd even go so far as to argue that June is just as stupid as Aristia, if not more so. Now that this hot mess of a story has finally reached its conclusion, Aristia and Ruthless finally reaffirm their feelings for each other, how Xena is eliminated, Aristia and Karsane officially end their tenuous friendship with each other, June gets to go free and fend for herself in this foreign world, Aristia is allowed to be both head of House Monique and Empress, and Ruthless makes a blood vow of love to Aristia. Everyone who's still alive lives happily ever after. Except maybe June. I don't want to. Fine, I'll do this properly. To simplify the plot summary, Season 1 was pretty good, all things considered. Season 2 was slow and set up certain plot points and plot devices. Season 3 started by wasting our time and grossly misused the pre-established plot devices or simply made up crappy new ones as needed. As far as the ending goes, I don't mind the Ruthless Aristia pairing. It is the most thematically appropriate and was obviously planned from the very beginning. A telling sign was when the 10-year-old Aristia visits the temple after reawakening in the new timeline. She converses with Vita, who challenges her to change her fate.
I challenge my fate!
Vita is also known as Fatium, the god of fate. I can only imagine Vita to be a cruel deity because it seems intent on funneling Aristia back to Ruthless, but adding just enough chaos in the form of June to make the whole ordeal as unpleasant as possible. Secondly, there is no way to incorporate June into the story if Aristia actually does break away from Ruthless. June's very existence, no matter how disappointing, is a giant source of conflict that must be utilized, and in order to do that, we need to have a Ruthless Aristia pairing. Especially if Ruv is characterized to be more sympathetic in the new timeline. Thirdly, there is the golden rule. The highest ranked male candidate always wins, especially if he is aesthetically pleasing. Considering that everyone in this webtoon manhwa is fundamentally designed to be aesthetically pleasing, I'm sure I don't need to point this out any further. To save yourself some disappointment in future titles, just assume that the highest ranked male will always win unless the author is actually trying to subvert your expectations. I'm of the opinion that Yuna planned the beginning and the end before writing the novel. This was probably intended to be a story of redemption between two fated lovers across time and space. If I just stop and look at the beginning and the ending without considering how we got there, then yes, I see a story with a lot of potential. The concept of fated lovers probably holds more appeal to a traditional Asian mindset as opposed to a more liberal Western audience. I don't throw out that statement with any real degree of certainty, but I think that might be the case. The only problem with this way of creating a narrative is that it doesn't really consider how to go from A to Z. Yuna probably wanted to explore the concepts of an obsessive idealistic love and a progressive passionate love, which is why she created the caricatures called Alendis and Karsane respectively. Alendis and Karsane are extremely simple archetypes to understand. One is a calm, cold, calculated persona, while the other is a strong-willed, hot-headed, and passionate youth. They were likely designed to help Tia understand love before returning to Ruthless. Just to spice things up, you'll notice that Alendis, despite his composed exterior, exhibits the fiery, obsessive, and highly romanticized version of love, while Karsane takes the opposite approach. What's really interesting about both candidates is that they express their love in ways supposedly counter to their character traits. Now this is where I think the first unfortunate thing happened. While using Aristia as a medium to explore these different facets of love, Yuna probably ended up developing Alendis too well in Season 1. Since he's not supposed to be the winner and would ruin the planned ending, he had to make his exit and give way to Karsane. You'll notice that Karsane's relationship with Aristia takes a relatively long time to grow, as opposed to Alendis, who's immediately infatuated with her from their very first meeting. Perhaps the only reason why Karsane wasn't unceremoniously written out of the plot in the final season was because the slow, progressive love he was meant to embody could also be used to explore the idea of what happens when you wait too long. It's the reason why his parting with Aristia is actually fantastic and extremely moving. A large portion of the fanbase likely resonated with Alendis' passionate ideal form of love, or with Karsane's unwavering progressive love so much that they lost sight of what the story was supposed to be about. In a way, the type of romance you yourself would like to experience is probably tied to who you preferred the most out of the candidates. Because of this unfortunate oversight, the moment Yuna finished the web novel, everyone was up in arms about the Ruve x Tia pairing. I mean, how many people do you know believe in a fated partner? And even if they did believe it, how many people were able to withstand the absolutely horrible endgame events that led to said prophesized ending? Now, the fanbase probably overreacted to the point where Ina, the one who created the webcomic adaptation, had no choice but to rush to the ending as soon as possible to limit the amount of unwarranted hate she would receive. This created an even messier endgame narrative. It's likely why every chapter except the very last one made little to no sense. In a way, having the story end the way it did was probably a miraculous feat already. I'm legitimately surprised the webcomic series wasn't just outright dropped. It would also explain why Jiun is simultaneously misused and underutilized. However, nothing I can think of excuses Aristia. Aristia Lamonique is not a good character. I am not referring to Season 3 Aristia either. She is a wildly inconsistent character who's being forced to do too many things in this narrative. What ends up happening is that we get wild shifts in her personality from one scene to the next. This is first exhibited in Season 2 and just becomes a norm in Season 3. There are moments where she's aware of her predicaments, like being aware of Alendis' feelings for her. However, there are moments where she's the biggest ignoramus in the world when rumors about her affair with Karsane circulate among the nobility. It's unfortunate, but the compelling tragic heroine from the story's introduction is not the same one we see over the course of the series. But this is not because she grows or develops. It truly feels like every time Aristia made one step of progress, the story forced her to take 2 steps back just so that we can refocus on her insecurities and tread along the same beaten path. The sheer number of times we had to go back and forth was asinine. I cannot tell if the plot warped itself to justify those insecurities, or if her personality had to bend in order to justify the plot. All in all, I think the Abandoned Empress had a solid beginning and an equally solid planned ending. What really killed it was the journey from one to the other. Thank you for watching this video to the end. I had originally intended to draft the script to defend this title as much as possible. I don't think I achieved my goal. Don't get me wrong, I'm glad I finished it and it would be a lie to say I didn't enjoy it. I hope I've given you something to think about. I did not expand on the romance between each of the candidates because I do believe that there's enough material to create 3 separate videos to explain each one, but it will be up to you whether you want to click on them and subject yourself to any more of this series. That's all I want to say for this video. Weebtooner, f***ing off. Did you know this script is over 6,000 words?
Sakpat.